Many things were running through my mind as we continued our journey. The fragile sturdiness of life, the luck we've had in our most recent exploits, curiosity regarding Renv, and above all else Nick's ability to continuously cast minor heal. Did casting it continuously have any benefit over casting it as a one-off? Can everyone cast it continuously, or just Nick? He had seemed confused while we were discussing it, as if he was surprised by our surprise. Is it just the basic nature of the spell to cast it continuously? If so, how did we not discover this sooner? I'd been taught my healing spells by a specialist, who had studied under other specialists, who had learned the concepts behind healing magic from ancient tomes. As far as I know, that's how every healer actually learns healing magic. Technically, you should be able to learn the spells on your own with a good deal of knowledge about anatomy and physiology, but I'm unaware of anyone who has. This is likely due to the fact that trying to learn anatomy and physiology on your own is difficult to do legally, and most who attempt to do it illegally end up facing rather dire consequences. Well-deserved, to be sure, but the end result is that they are not in a position to pass on any secrets they garner. I'd previously told Nick that he might be able to cast healing, just to see if he could. He seemed to have quite a bit of knowledge, so it wasn't a stretch to imagine he knew a thing or two about how a body functions. If he hadn't, I would have taken him to a specialist when our travels were somewhat less urgent. Nick has saved us a trip, but simultaneously opened a can of crawlers without a single fishing line in sight. And that's how I learned the spell, Nick explained to a shocked audience. Even Nash's mouth was agape, despite his attempts to remain stoic. The dwarf had asked plenty of questions, demonstrating an unfamiliarity with magic. Imlor looked paler and paler as the story had gone on, likely due to it describing his near demise. Imlor's a clever one. He'd quite easily put together the fact that if Nick hadn't been with us, he'd have died. Even if he had ignored Renv's urgent situation with the bandits and continued on, his cart would have been right next to the explosion when it had occurred. That kind of proximity wouldn't have allowed for survival, even if he'd managed to avoid shrapnel. "Well, it's no wonder you lost consciousness," I said with a smile. "You burned through all your reserves, and you were injured on top of that. It would have been odd if you hadn't passed out. Not quite as odd as continuously casting minor heal, though." "Why's that odd?" Nick asked. "Because it's like wind spear," I answered. "It has a singular effect, or at least that's what I was led to believe. I don't even know what the benefit of holding the spell actually could be." "Well," Nash interjected, "Imlor had a through and through. One minor heal would have stopped the bleeding and maybe stabilized him, but it would have taken a bunch of castings to close the wound entirely, right?" I turned to look at my brother, who had once again found the stone I'd been blindly stumbling over, and gave him a silent nod. I had dismissed anything odd about Imlor's wound due to the powerful nature of Nick's casting abilities. My mind had simply written it off as another instance of one of his spells being more powerful than it should be. Stupid of me, to be sure. Unlike some spells, healing spells don't get more potent the more magic you put into them. They have a set cost and a set result, which is why there are different types. Minor heal can stabilize someone that is mortally wounded for a time. Lesser heal will repair internal injury and regenerate lost blood. Major heal can repair gratuitous injury and broken bones, and greater heal can regenerate lost limbs. Each spell grants a brief amount of regeneration, and can also do what the previous levels can, but cost exponentially more magic to cast. As Nash pointed out, these spells have a compounding effect, meaning that depending on the wound, casting minor heal 3 times can be more efficient than casting lesser heal once. But Nick had only cast minor heal the 1 time, so it shouldn't have been possible to completely heal Imlor. Therefore, the benefit to continuous casting minor heal is that it has a similar effect to casting it multiple times. A blood-drenched piece of wood clattered to the floor of the cart, originating from one of Nick's wounds. This wasn't the first time it had happened, and Nick, having become used to this by now, casually picked it up and tossed it over the side of the cart. Suddenly, a thought occurred to me. "Nick, was that the last piece of shrapnel?" I asked. Nick took a moment to consult 10 and then nodded. "I'd like to do an experiment," I smiled. Ask 10 if it's okay for me to cast a healing spell on you. 10 says that would be okay, Nick said after another moment. Good, I said. Laya ronim tsak. I tried to hold the spell, and was surprised when it actually worked. We watched the wound on Nick's hand close with a mixture of shock and glee. The glee was mostly from me. However, I also noticed that the spell was very quickly draining my magic reserve. I stopped the spell before I ran out of magic, but it was a rather close call. I wouldn't want to be passing out like Nick had. Well, that answers several questions, I said, managing to stifle my excitement. First, you can continue the regenerative effect of Minor Heal by continuously casting it. Second, it costs magic for every second that you maintain the spell. Overall, it's more efficient than casting the spell multiple times. We'll need to have the official literature updated. For every second? Nash asked. Is it better than, Lesser Heal? Not quite. I suspect that if Lesser Heal can also be continuously cast, the regenerative effect would be much more efficient, I answered. I'd love to do more experimentation, but it will have to wait. I know some pretty advanced healers, Renv added. If you'd like, I can bring this to their attention and make sure they credit you and Nick with the discovery. They would happily perform the experimentation that you want done. Nash gave me a knowing look, but I held up a hand to keep him from speaking for me. He knows how much I love scientific inquiry, and having others perform experiments in my stead would typically be a worst-case scenario for me. However, normally I would rather do the experiments myself, but since we're speaking of magic that can save lives, I will gratefully accept your assistance, I replied. Really? Nash asked. Yes. We don't know if we will find any answers in Bolasir, and we've given our oath to aid Nick in finding his way home, I said. It would be difficult to travel and research these phenomena simultaneously, at least while observing any semblance of scientific rigor. Since this may save lives, time is of the essence. Therefore, it only makes sense to have someone else begin research immediately. That's pretty mature of you, Nash said with a proud smirk. But if we do find answers in Bolasir and wrap things up quickly, I can always join in on the research, I quickly added. Scientific competition is healthy, after all. Yeah, that sounds more like you. We all had a good laugh, and when we were finished, Renv looked contemplative. You said you swore to help Nick find his way home? I already gathered that he's not from around here, but how far away are we talking? He asked. I'm right here, you know, Nick chuckled. Oh, right. Apologies. Then I redirect my questions to you, good sir. Renv bowed his head apologetically. That's all right, Nick said. I'm from a different world, and there's no way to know how distant that world is. I'm kind of assuming that it's an alternate reality kind of thing, but I guess it's possible that I was abducted from my world by aliens and brought here for some reason. Nick noted that we were all staring at him incredulously. Well, it's a thought, he said quietly. Someone from a different country might have abducted you and brought you here? Renv asked. No, not that kind of alien, Nick quickly explained. Like a different species that has the ability to travel through space. Space? Nash asked. Yeah, you know, above the sky? Nick asked in return. If you go up high enough, you end up in space. He's right, I confirmed. Not much is known about space, so I suppose it's possible. Magic is definitely the more likely possibility, though. Why's that? Nick asked. Because space is very, very big. The sheer distances involved would require magical traversal, I explained. So even if you were abducted by space aliens, magic is probably what brought you here. I don't know, he said. My people were to the point of limited space travel, and some were even living in space stations. We were about to get to the point of consumer space travel, so there's been plenty of scientific theories among my people regarding how to travel space faster. It's possible someone beat us to it. We all stared at him once again, this time with our mouths agape. There were so many questions running through my mind all at once. What was space like? How did his people get up to space in the first place? What did they find? Why the hell hadn't he mentioned that before? He noticed our slack jaws. I haven't been to space myself, he explained. There isn't any air up there, so you've got to wear a special airtight suit with tanks of air that feed into it. It also costs a lot of money to build the vehicles necessary to get there, So they only sent the best and brightest at first. As more experiments and flights were performed, rich merchants started going to space themselves. As far as I know, they were only able to just barely make it to space. There isn't any air in space, Nash asked. That makes sense, actually, I said. The higher you go up a mountain, the less air there is. I'm assuming that the space carts were launched from the tops of mountains? We call them spaceships, and I don't think so. I know that they launch a bunch from a place called Cape Canaveral, which I'm pretty sure is close to sea level, Nick said. I don't think it makes much of a difference. Space is really far up, even compared to the tallest of mountains. What did your people find in space? Renv asked. Well, it's like Yulk said. Everything is really, really far apart. In between the planets and stuff, there's a whole lot of nothing, too. So there wasn't a lot of interest in exploring space outside of specific scientific communities. I do remember seeing some news about plans to mine some asteroids, but I don't know what became of that. What about on the planets? Imlor asked. Well, we landed remote control robots on some of them to explore and see if we could find life, but as far as I know, we didn't find much. People were getting excited about finding water on one of the planets, but other than that, they're pretty barren. I don't think any of them have breathable air either. Nick shrugged. Wait, you said that humans don't have magic, Nash said. How did you make ships that made it that far into the sky? I watched Renv's expression as Nick explained humanity's method of travel via explosive propulsion. I had been shocked to learn of it, but the dwarf was absolutely flabbergasted. It was hard to see Imlor's expression, but he was obviously paying close attention to what Nick was saying. I chuckled slightly, enjoying the novelty of the conversation. So even without magic, your people can fly like birds? Renvi asked. Not really, Nick said. We've got a bunch of different kinds of aircraft, but I'm pretty sure all of them move much faster than birds do. Plus, most planes carry a bunch of people at once. It's the fastest way to go from one continent to another. That's amazing, the dwarf replied. I had to agree. The more I learned about humans, the more I wanted to know. I desperately wanted to compare our development to their own, but I doubt that Nick would have that kind of information at his age. Plus, there are certain aspects of human history that he is obviously uncomfortable sharing. I could imagine why. Everyone has darkness in their pasts they'd like to forget. If kingdoms form on a bed of flowers, it's because those flowers were fed with blood. There's something up ahead, Imlor called out. What is it? I stood to get a better look. It looks like... The gnome paused. A checkpoint? This is boring, my friend complained. Most things are, I replied. We've got nothing better to do, though. Yeah, but I thought this road was supposed to be busy. There hasn't been anyone all day. Your whining will do nothing to change that. As the words left my mouth, the sound of hooves and wooden wheels in the distance filled my ears. They were still fairly far away, but my friend's face twisted into a smug expression. I sighed, straightened my Bolasier guard uniform, and sat in the place that I was supposed to be sitting. My friend leaned on the barricade, their feminine curves fighting desperately against the uniform. Their positioning was obviously intended to bring notice to the aforementioned curves. That doesn't mean anything. It's just a coincidence. Oh, please. You know better than that, they grinned. No, I don't, I said sarcastically. I don't know anything. I'm empty of all forms of knowledge. My friend giggled as the travelers came into view. 2 carts pulled by 2 Hanarses carrying quite the interesting bunch. A pair of orcs, a gnome, a dwarf, and something else. Almost like an elf, but with an extremely murky aura. Power, danger, cunning, hunger, sorrow, ambition, and so many other things swirled around this creature. Things were further complicated by the positive emissions, which were just as intense. Innocence, love, kindness, compassion, happiness, and so on. It's not exactly uncommon to feel all these things at once from someone, but the intensity was an entirely different matter. It spoke of a remarkable capacity for cruelty and heroism, a living contradiction. I glanced over to my friend, who was just as terrified as I was by this thing. It reminded me of the tales that were told to fresh-born to keep them from running off on their own. Horrible monsters that wielded rough iron and could destroy anything, lurking in the darkest corners, waiting to pounce. I desperately didn't want to interact with this thing, but there might not be another chance like this. We simply do not have any other choice. I shrugged off my abject terror, took a deep breath, and stood. I picked up my pencil and book, completing my act. "What's this?" the gnome asked. "Taxes were thin last fiscal year, so this is a toll road now," my friend said. "To pass, I'll need to take your names," I added, gesturing with the open book. "We will then determine if you must pay the toll." There was a long pause from the group that made my skin crawl. It's not good for us when they start to think about things. I took a long look at them and noticed weapons and signs of fighting. Oh no, they might be adventurers. They're not about to attack us, are they? I gulped down my fear and stood firm. The dwarf was whispering to the bald orc, and the bald orc was whispering back. I could hear what they were saying, but I couldn't understand it. They didn't want me to know what they were saying, and because of this, I couldn't know what they were saying. Such is the nature of things. The weird one said, "My name is—" "How much is the toll?" the bald orc interrupted. I looked at my friend, demonstrating my annoyance to them privately, and then turned back to the group. "That depends. I'll need your name, please," I answered with an authoritative tone. "And what, pray tell, will you be doing with our names if we give them to you?" the bald one asked with a grin. So the game begins. It's possible that he's figured it out, but we're well versed with this particular battle of wits. They would have to be crazy to hurl accusations at guards, and that works out well because we're trying to avoid the crazy ones. I'll be writing it down and checking to see if it's already in my other book. If it is, then you'll pay a discounted toll or even no toll at all. If it's not, then we discuss how much the toll is, I answered, trying my best not to grin. The rest of the group was looking at the bald one with confusion. The gnome looked back at me, and some glint of clarification scrolled across otherwise his boring features. Damn it. "May I see this other book that our names may already be in?" the bald one asked. "For what purpose would you need to see the book other than to attempt to fraud us?" I countered. "I'll not entertain a scoundrel. Now give me your name." "I am not a scoundrel. I am simply curious as to why a Fae would be collecting taxes for the kingdom of Bolasir." "Ah, so he knows that we're Fae. Not necessarily a problem, as he may not yet have guessed our intentions." I heard a sigh come from my friend, and I held out a hand to calm them. The game isn't over yet. "Why wouldn't a Fae be collecting taxes?" I asked. "Have you never seen an employed Fae before?" "Can't say that I have, and you know how we mortals are. We're suspicious of things we haven't seen before." He grinned. "What use would you even have for currency?" "To purchase goods and services, of course. Doesn't the forest provide everything your kind desires?" "Obviously not, or we wouldn't be here." "What sort of things do you buy?" "I don't need to tell you that. All I need is your names," I stated coldly. "Why don't you set our minds at ease by telling us your name first?" the bald one asked. Slithering copulation. The orc was familiar with my kind, and knew how to play this game. It seemed like an innocent enough request, a name for a name, but he knew damned well what he was doing by asking for ours. The bastard had even phrased it in such a way that it would be suspicious were I to decline. I didn't particularly feel like playing the fool and dancing around the subject, and a quick look at my friend told me that they didn't want to either. "Very well, begging it is." "Fair enough," I said. "We do not have names. We require them, which is why we're asking for yours." "Oh," the weird one said, finally catching on. "Why would you need our names, though?" the orc with braids asked. "Can't you name yourselves?" "If we could, we would," my friend said. "We cannot, and as such beg your kindness." Their feminine form was specifically designed to appeal to the mortal sense of lust in a situation like this. Mine was masculine and intended to have the same effect on those with the opposite preference. It's hard to say no to a sexy fae in uniform. Unfortunately, this tactic was lost on the orcs. Their auras did not indicate nearly enough cruelty for them to be wowed by our physical distractions. The dwarf and the gnome, perhaps, but they were both being careful not to even look at us. That only left the thing. I stifled a shudder at the thought. If we give you our names, then what will we be called? The bald one asked, still grinning. I said haltingly. It was a surprising question. I don't know, actually. Probably whatever you want, my friend added. That's how it works with you mortals, isn't it? Not quite, the bald one said. When you take our names, you take our identity and merge it with your own, leaving us without knowledge of who we are. Silence fell among us. Fear riddled the auras of the other mortals. My friend and I shared confused glances. Why would they be afraid of not knowing who they are? Aren't mortals only afraid of death or serious injury? I don't understand. You say that like it's a bad thing, I ventured. But that's how we live. I do not have a name, and therefore don't know who I am. Well, imagine for a moment that you did have a name. Imagine that you know who you are. Your identity impacts the world around you, and you have many tales to tell to those who would listen. Would you willingly part with that? The bald one asked sagely. Do you feel it right to take that from someone else? No, I wouldn't willingly part with it, but life is about taking from the things around you to further your own existence, I said. You need energy to complete yourselves, so you take the lives of animals, and those animals take the lives of plants for the same purpose. We take your identities for our completion, to further our existence just as you do. What happens if you don't? The weird one asked hesitantly. We perish, my friend said. Our story ends as the season does if we do not have an identity to anchor us. They get reborn, though, the bald one explained. Death is temporary to a fae. It's not exactly pleasant, though, I said. The withering alone is likely much more painful than anything you've ever experienced. Also, our sense of self gets reset. Who we are fades to nothingness when we die, and we are someone different when we are reborn, my friend added. I thought you didn't have a sense of self, the weird one said. Of course we do. It's what drives us to gain an identity, I explained. Without an identity, we lose our current sense of self to the void. Sure, we're born again come next season, but we will have different personalities, preferences, and no memory of who we were before. We end up becoming a completely different fae. Which explains why you would want our names, the bald one nodded slowly. However, we need our names. There are those who depend upon us. Even if we tried to force the issue, they're smart enough to know that they can remove any obstacles we put in their path. Should we let them continue on and just hope someone dumber comes along? Is there some way we can convince them? Perhaps a bribe or a promise? No, I can feel their determination. This won't work. We will need to regroup and find another. Wait, all you need are names, right? The weird one asked. What if we named you? Well, I paused and looked at my friend who shrugged. Names have power. You would have to sacrifice a large amount of magic to name us, and we would have to be willing to accept the name. For what reason would you not accept the name? The bald one asked. I looked at my friend again. Revealing this could prove dangerous, but they gestured for me to continue. They're right, of course. We're in too deep to hold back now. I sighed and straightened my borrowed uniform nervously. If you name us, you will be taking part in our creation, and we will be forever in your debt. I realize that your kind uses this as a turn of phrase, but we mean it literally. We would be under your authority for as long as you are able to give us orders, and anything you order us to do, we will have to do, I explained. So we are left with a conundrum. Which is better, slavery or death? It would just be temporary, my friend giggled. They're mortals, after all. What if I promise not to order you around? The weird one asked. You can make promises unbreakable, right? The innocence of that question took me off guard. I looked at the strange being as if seeing it for the first time. I had been avoiding looking directly at it because of the maelstrom that is its aura, but once I looked past that, I realized that I was looking at a young boy. An odd young boy whose ears and teeth were wrong, but one who was genuine in its beliefs. My heart melted somewhat as I realized that this innocent youth actually believed that kind of power was possible. It didn't melt enough to keep me from taking full advantage of this mistaken belief, though. I quickly thought of a bluff, and a way to make that bluff convincing. It would require a blood pact, but yes, I lied. Okay, the thing said as it leapt from the cart. How do we do that? As the weird one approached me, it suddenly occurred to me that mixing my blood with this thing might be a bad idea. Blood is an odd thing, and the mixing of it can lead to some strange happenings. It had been the first thing to leap to mind, though, and now I have to go with it because it would be suspicious. Unless I can think of something. It's simple, I said, trying desperately to think of something to get me out of this. In your own words, express your promise and the consequences of not adhering to it. Then, if I agree to your promise, we cut our palms and clasp hands. Our blood will mingle, and the promise will become binding. And then I can name you, and we can be on our way, it said happily. Got it. It stood before me, and we met each other's gaze as it thought of what to say. The dark blue of its glimmering eyes reminded me of the shiny stones that the fairies loved to steal from wandering merchants. Inside this deep blue was a hint of green, which is reminiscent of the grove in which I'd been reborn. The eyes of mortals are such beautiful things, I can definitely see why the hags collect them. I hereby promise that I will not intentionally force a fae to perform any action against their will by enforcing their debt to me. May I die if I break this promise. I went over the sentence in my mind to make sure it hadn't performed any trickery with its words. The promise wouldn't be binding, but I still had to call out any trickery to make sure it believed the performance. Using the word intentional made certain that if it accidentally enforced the debt, it could simply apologize, and it made sure to clarify that enforcing the debt would be the breach of promise. So if it came to odds with a fae, it still had recourse. The consequence was rather mundane, but it served the purpose of ensuring that it couldn't become our master. The thing would only be able to give one order. Clever. Unfortunately, I still hadn't thought of a way out of mingling our blood. But I decided that I liked this weird little child. What's the worst that could happen if we mix blood? I smiled and gave a nod of assent. Then, I hardened the nail of my left forefinger into a sharp edge and sliced my right palm deep enough for blood to flow. The weird one offered its hand, and I made a similar cut on the offered palm. I held my hand up with my fingers spread apart as the weird one extended its hand forward. It looked at my hand and back to its own as I looked at its hand and back to my own. Our eyes met again, and I raised my eyebrow, wondering what it was doing. Its lips disappeared as it made an awkward expression, and it finally clasped its hand with mine. I froze as our blood mingled, and a shock ran through my form. A life began to flash before my eyes.